This here, it's old news, okay? I said I didn't want to do news. And by the time the segment comes out, it's going to be 2 weeks. But that's fine. It's fine. Because it's still important. It is a resignation that happened. So this is what we're going to read. We're not going to read the article, actually. So what happened is top UN official in New York steps down, citing genocide of Palestinian civilians. And for sure, like that's some pretty big news in itself. But I think what is important with this news is to read the actual resignation letter. What is he saying, Craig Muckhiber? So on the 28th of October 2023, the United Nations, Dear High Commissioner, this will be my last official communication to you as Director of the New York Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. I write at a moment of great anguish for the world, including for many of our colleagues. Once again, we are seeing a genocide unfolding before our eyes, and the organization that we serve appears powerless to stop it. As someone who has invested human rights in Palestine since the 1980s, lived in Gaza as a UN human rights advisor in the 1990s, and carried out several human rights missions to the country before and since, this is deeply personal to me. I also worked in these halls through the genocides against the Tutsis, Bosnian Muslims, the Yazidi, and the Rohingya. In each case, when the dust settled on the horrors that had been perpetrated against defenseless civilian populations, it became painfully clear that we had failed in our duty to meet the imperatives of prevention of mass atrocities, of protection of the vulnerable, and of accountability for perpetrators. And so it has been with successive waves of murder and persecution against the Palestinians throughout the entire life of the UN. High Commissioner, we are failing again. As a human rights lawyer with more than 3 decades of experience in the field, I know well that the concept of genocide has often been subject to political abuse. But the current wholesale slaughter of the Palestinian people, rooted in an ethno-nationalist settler colonial ideology, in continuation of decades of their systematic persecution and purging, based entirely upon their status as Arabs, and coupled with explicit statements of intent by leaders in the Israeli government and military, leaves no room for doubt or debate. In Gaza, civilian homes, schools, churches, mosques, and medical institutions are wantonly attacked as thousands of civilians are massacred. In the West Bank, including occupied Jerusalem, homes are seized and reassigned based entirely on race, and violent settler pogroms are accompanied by Israeli military units. Across the land, apartheid rules. This is a textbook case of genocide. The European ethno-nationalist settler colonial project in Palestine has entered its final phase toward the expedited destruction of the last remnants of indigenous Palestinian life in Palestine. What's more, the governments of the United States, the United Kingdom, and much of Europe are wholly complicit in the horrific assault. Not only are the governments refusing to meet their treaty obligations to ensure respect for the Geneva Conventions, but they are in fact actively arming the assault, providing economic and intelligence support, and giving political and diplomatic cover for Israel's atrocities. Volker Turk, High Commissioner for Human Rights, Palais Wilson, Geneva. In concert with this, Western corporate media, increasingly captured and state agent, are in open breach of Article 20 of the ICCPR, continuously dehumanizing Palestinians to facilitate the genocide and broadcasting propaganda for war and advocacy of national, racial, or religious hatred that constitutes incitement to discrimination, hostility, and violence. US-based social media companies are suppressing the voices of human rights defenders while amplifying pro-Israel propaganda. Israel lobby online trolls and gongos are harassing and smearing human rights defenders, and Western universities and employers are collaborating with them to punish those who dare to speak out against the atrocities. In the wake of this genocide, there must be an accounting for these actors as well, just as there was for Radio Mille Collines in Rwanda. In such circumstances, the demands on our organization for principled and effective action are greater than ever, but we have not met the challenge. The Protective Enforcement Power Security Council has again been blocked by US intransigence. The SG is under assault for the mildest of protestations, and our human rights mechanisms are under sustained slanderous attack by an organized online impunity network. Decades of distraction by the illusory and largely disingenuous promises of Oslo have diverted the organization from its core duty to defend international law, international human rights, and the Charter itself. The mantra of the two-state solution has become an open joke in the corridors of the UN, both for its utter impossibility in fact and for its total failure to account for the inalienable human rights of the Palestinian people. The so-called quartet has become nothing more than a fig leaf for inaction and for subservience to a brutal status quo. The US scripted deference to, open quote, agreements between the parties themselves, end quote, in place of international law, was always a transparent sleight of hand, designed to reinforce the power of Israel over the rights of the occupied and dispossessed Palestinians. High Commissioner, I came to this organization first in the 1980s because I found in it a principled, norm-based institution that was squarely on the side of human rights, including in cases where the powerful US, UK, and Europe were not on our side. While my own government, its subsidiary institutions, and much of the US media were still supporting or justifying South African apartheid, Israeli oppression, and Central American death squads, the UN was standing up for the oppressed peoples of those lands. We had international law on our side. We had human rights on our side. We had principle on our side. Our authority was rooted in our integrity, but no more. In recent decades, key parts of the UN have surrendered to the power of the US and to fear of the Israel lobby, to abandon these principles and to retreat from international law itself. We have lost a lot in this abandonment, not least our own global credibility. But the Palestinian people have sustained the biggest losses as a result of our failures. It is a stunning historic irony that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted in the same year that the Nakba was perpetrated against the Palestinian people. As we commemorate the 75th anniversary of the UDHR, we would do well to abandon the old cliché that the UDHR was born out of the atrocities that preceded it, and to admit that it was born alongside one of the most atrocious genocides of the 20th century, that of the destruction of Palestine. In some senses, the framers were promising human rights to everyone except the Palestinian people. And let us remember as well that the UN itself carries the original sin of helping to facilitate the dispossession of the Palestinian people by ratifying the European settler colonial project that seized Palestinian land and turned it over to the colonists. We have much for which to atone. But the path to atonement is clear. We have much to learn from the principled stance taken in cities around the world in recent days, as masses of people stand up against the genocide, even at risk of beatings and arrest. Palestinians and their allies, human rights defenders of every stripe, Christian and Muslim organizations, and progressive Jewish voices saying "not in our name" are all leading the way. All we have to do is to follow them. Yesterday, just a few blocks from here, New York's Grand Central Station was completely taken over by thousands of Jewish human rights defenders standing in solidarity with the Palestinian people and demanding an end to Israel tyranny, many risking arrest in the process. In doing so, they stripped away in an instant the Israeli Hasbara propaganda point, an old anti-Semitic trope that Israel somehow represents the Jewish people. It does not. And as such, Israel is solely responsible for its crimes. On this point, it bears repeating, in spite of Israel lobby smears to the contrary, that criticism of Israel's human rights violations is not anti-Semitic, any more than criticism of Saudi violations is Islamophobic, criticism of Myanmar violations is anti-Buddhist, or criticism of Indian violations is anti-Hindu. When they seek to silence us with smears, we must raise our voice, not lower it. I trust you will agree, High Commissioner, that this is what speaking truth to power is all about. But I also find hope in those parts of the UN that have refused to compromise the organization's human rights principles in spite of enormous pressures to do so. Our independent special reporters commissions of inquiry, and treaty body experts, alongside most of our staff, have continued to stand up for the human rights of the Palestinian people, even as other parts of the UN, even at the highest levels, have shamefully bowed their heads to power. As the custodians of the human rights norms and standards, OHCHR has a particular duty to defend those standards. Our job, I believe, is to make our voice heard, from the Secretary General to the newest UN recruit, and horizontally across the wider UN system, insisting that the human rights of the Palestinian people are not up for debate, negotiation, or compromise anywhere under the blue flag. What, then, would a UN norm-based position look like? For what would we work if we were true to our rhetorical admonitions about human rights and equality for all? Accountability for perpetrators, redress for victims, protection of the vulnerable, and empowerment for rights holders, all under the rule of law. The answer, I believe, is simple. If we have the clarity to see beyond the propagandistic smokescreens that distort the vision of justice to which we are sworn, the courage to abandon fear and deference to powerful states, and the will to truly take up the banner of human rights and peace. To be sure, this is a long-term project and a steep climb, but we must begin now or surrender to unspeakable horror. I see 10 essential points. 1. Legitimate action. First, we in the UN must abandon the failed and largely disingenuous Oslo paradigm, its illusory two-state solution, its impotent and complicit quartet, and its subjugation of international law to the dictates of presumed political expediency. Our positions must be unapologetically based on international human rights and international law. 2. Clarity of vision. We must stop the pretense that this is simply a conflict over land or religion between two warring parties and admit the reality of the situation in which a disproportionately powerful state is colonizing, persecuting, and dispossessing an indigenous population on the basis of their ethnicity. 3. One state based on human rights. We must support the establishment of a single, democratic, secular state in all of historic Palestine with equal rights for Christians, Muslims, and Jews, and, therefore, the dismantling of the deeply racist settler colonial project and an end to apartheid across the land. 4. Fighting apartheid. We must redirect all UN efforts and resources to the struggle against apartheid, just as we did for South Africa in the 1970s, 80s, and early 90s. 5. Return and compensation. We must reaffirm and insist on the right to return and full compensation for all Palestinians and their families currently living in the occupied territories, in Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, and in the diaspora across the globe. 6. Truth and justice. We must call for a transitional justice process, making full use of decades of accumulated UN investigations, inquiries, and reports to document the truth and to ensure accountability for all perpetrators, redress for all victims, and remedies for documented injustices. 7. Protection. We must press for the development of a well-resourced and strongly mandated UN protection force with a sustained mandate to protect civilians from the river to the sea. 8. Disarmament. We must advocate for the removal and destruction of Israel's massive stockpiles of nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons, lest the conflict lead to the total destruction of the region and possibly beyond. 9. Mediation. We must recognize that the US and other Western powers are in fact not credible mediators, but rather actual parties to the conflict who are complicit with Israel in the violation of Palestinian rights, and we engage engage them as such. 10. Solidarity. We must open our doors and the doors of the SG wide to the legions of Palestinian, Israeli, Jewish, Muslim, and Christian human rights defenders who are standing in solidarity with the people of Palestine and their human rights, and stop the unconstrained flow of Israel lobbyists to the offices of UN leaders where they advocate for continued war, persecution, apartheid, and impunity, and smear our human rights defenders for their principled defense of Palestinian rights. This will take years to achieve, and Western powers will fight us every step of the way, so we must be steadfast. In the immediate term, we must work for an immediate ceasefire and an end to the long-standing siege on Gaza, stand up against the ethnic cleansing of Gaza, Jerusalem, and the West Bank, and elsewhere, document the genocidal assault in Gaza, help to bring massive humanitarian aid and reconstruction to the Palestinians, take care of our traumatized colleagues and their families, and fight like hell for a principled approach in the UN's political offices. The UN's failure in Palestine thus far is not a reason for us to withdraw. Rather, it should give us the courage to abandon the failed paradigm of the past and fully embrace a more principled course. Let us, as OHCHR, boldly and proudly join the anti-apartheid movement that is growing all around the world, adding our logo to the banner of equality and human rights for the Palestinian people. The world is watching. We will all be accountable for where we stood at this crucial moment in history. Let us stand on the side of justice. I thank you, High Commissioner Volker, for hearing this final appeal from my desk. I will leave the office in a few days for the last time, after more than 3 decades of service. But please do not hesitate to reach out if I can be of assistance in the future. Sincerely, Craig Mockheiber. So, wasn't that great? So what's going on in chat? Let's read chat. Let's see what you guys think of this. If you think this is powerful, if you think this is inconsequential, do you think this will be important? I mean, we've had a week pass, and a lot of people apparently in chat didn't even know about it. So did it? Him calling this a genocide is wrong and insulting, to be honest. How is this insulting, Christopher? What else would you call it? I agree that it isn't a genocide. Really? People don't believe it's a genocide? Interesting. PF Prologue said it's not genocide, it's retaliation. This is okay. So Krenna says this is a war beyond retaliation. Retaliation is an excuse to do what the government actually wants to do, which is genocide. Yeah. We've talked about on the stream how very often, especially terrorist attacks, are framed in such a way that they are used opportunistically as a way to do what the government actually wants to do, which is, depending on the situation, which is very often invading the country from which the terrorist attack came from. Chat is on fire, Christopher. Yeah. The numbers and intent don't add up for it to be a genocide. 20% of Israeli population is Arab too. Israel's population is Arab too. Well, consider this. Like, let's say you want to completely erase Gaza from the map. You know, like, let's say you want to bomb it out of existence so that, for example, there's no infrastructure, no hospitals, no schools, no mosques, no nothing, which, you know, could open up the possibility of replacing everyone with people from your own country. Let's say it's just that, right? Let's say it's completely crumbled. Everything's in ashes, right? People don't even live there because it's so fucking dangerous. Let's say you want to resettle there, right? And you set a couple of your own settlers, and they build houses, they build new hospitals, they build, you know, I feel like pushing someone out of their land is, I mean, what do people think genocide is? Maybe that's important to know. What are people saying when they're saying it's not genocide? How many people must die before we call it a genocide? Also, like, very often the people are afraid of calling it genocide until it actually happens. There's different stages of genocide. People have been going over it, and like the people think that like genocide only means mass killing, which it doesn't necessarily mean mass killing. It's to kill not necessarily the people, but kill the culture, kill the existence of the people, not necessarily the individuals. Genocide is the intentional destruction of a people in whole or in part. United Nations Genocide Convention says any of the 5 acts committed with the intent of to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. These 5 acts were killing members of the group, causing them seriously bodily harm or mental harm, imposing living conditions intent to destroy the group, preventing births, and forcibly transferring children out of the group. Victims are targeted because of their real or perceived membership of a group, not randomly. It's not necessarily camps. Christopher Jordan Dorner, what would you need for like what would be like a sufficient? And I'm not asking that in bad faith. Like, what would be a sufficient action or like proof, evidence that there's genocide going on in Gaza. If Israel flattens or has intent to flatten Gaza and its inhabitants and removing all Arabs from Israel and Gaza. Okay. That's, I mean, intent is really hard to determine, because they're never going to say, yeah, our intent is to flatten Gaza, though they've came really close to saying it. But you say if Israel flattens, it's in the process of flattening though, isn't it? So we only call it a genocide once it's finally flattened? Do we wait for it to flatten to call it genocide? Since October 7th, 4,800 children were killed. That's not including the people who are severely injured or who are living through trauma right now. You know, you don't even have to kill them for, at least in terms of the UN, like, you know, you don't even have to kill members of the group. You can just impose living conditions intended to destroy the group. That's not even necessarily killing. You can even just causing them serious bodily or mental harm. Temporary displacement to fight militants is allowed under international law. It is what US did in Iraq, and Mosul, for example. Yeah, great. Let's take the US as a great example. I wouldn't say the US is necessarily trying to genocide Raqqa and Mosul, right? But let's say you look at the precedent, and let's say the US was trying for decades to annex Raqqa and Mosul, trying to settle Americans in that region. Wouldn't that be different? I think the context here is important. And where are people supposed to go? Like, Gaza is really small. I live in Montreal. I used to live in Montreal. I don't live in Montreal anymore. And Montreal is an island. Okay, I'll just show you really quickly. This is the island of Montreal. Okay? Gaza is smaller than the Isle of Montreal. I'm personally comfortable to call it a genocide. And I guess only time will convince those who are not convinced right now. And if we're wrong and Israel's like, yeah, we're willing to live alongside Palestinians, then I will be proven wrong. If Israel's like, yeah, let's do that. Let's end the apartheid state. But I'm laughing. It's not funny, but it just goes to show how I think it might be a bit ridiculous to not see it as genocide. But that's just me. This has this rhetoric that, you know, historically Israel has wanted peace. Palestine didn't want to settle without having all the land. Is the same kind of colonial, under colonialism, very often colonial powers will say they want peace, right? In terms of oppression, the people in power will say they want peace, because peace to them means the status quo and means everything's going good. But once if you are a victim of apartheid, for example, or segregation or discrimination, peace just means the status quo. It just means that your situation of discrimination, your situation of apartheid is still in place. It's peace for one side. It's not for both. Someone in chat just said, if this is a genocide, then I'd say the Russia/Ukraine conflict is a genocide. Let me show you something. The Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights says it has confirmed the death of almost 8,500 civilians since Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine last year, and believes the toll could be thousands higher. 8,500 civilians, 8,500 deaths. That's not considering people who are actually fighting. That's in a year. What's been going on in Gaza is happening on a territory that's thousands of times smaller than Ukraine. And it's been a month now, so on a time scale that's 12 times shorter. Yet, the number of Palestinians killed in Gaza since Hamas attacked Israel on October 7th has surpassed 10,000. On a territory that's a lot smaller, for a population that's a lot smaller, and on a time frame that is a lot smaller, more Palestinians have died than Ukrainians. It's actually insane. If Russia was more capable and wasn't so fucking useless and the West didn't help Ukraine, it would absolutely be a genocide too. Do stats define a genocide? No, not necessarily. you can have genocidal intent, right? But it's not necessarily as problematic if you don't have the means to do it. Let's say Russia wanted to genocide Ukraine, right? Well, first they couldn't. They didn't have Ukraine had the backing of the West, thankfully, and it was just impossible for them, despite the mass graves and disallowing Ukrainian languages, blah blah blah, language, but they didn't. But the thing is, Israel has not only the intent, but also the capacity and the backing of the highest powers of in the world. I mean, intent is hard to quantify, right? So stats, no, they don't define a genocide, but they can help to show a trend, right? Another stat I saw. Again, no, you can't define genocide by stats, right? And all that. And this is not even about necessarily genocide. It's again, it's like a way to compare. The Israeli army has dropped 18,000 tons of bombs on the Gaza Strip since October 7th. That's in less than a month, or about 1.5 times the explosive force of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. So genocide equals intent plus power. Yeah, imagine 10 people are like, we are going to commit a genocide, but they're only 10, right? Yes, they do have the intent. They might get to torture a couple of people, but whatever the actions become, if they don't have the power, they don't have, you can't characterize that as a genocide, even though it's intentional, though it's intended to be. Yeah, you can never prove intent, only infer it, unless they make it very clear.